Hi, I'm Jimmy Vermeer, the creator of a new voting system called Ranked Comparisons. You may remember me from other YouTube videos where I talk about politics, praising people like Rona Ambrose and bashing people like Laurel Broughton. I developed this voting system as part of a college project I did back in 2008 with my classmates Zach Tewald and Jeremy Tan. In this video, I'm going to explain why Ranked Comparisons is better than any voting system currently in place anywhere in the world. I, with my partners, have written a 12-page document explaining the system in detail, but for those of you who don't like reading, enjoy watching this video instead. It's a long video and you don't have to watch the whole thing, but if you do, thank you. When you see me wearing a hat like this, it means I'm speaking as another person, and when I take the hat off, I'm myself again. Got it? Good. So why do we need a new voting system? What's wrong with the one we have? The voting system we currently have in place here in Canada and in most countries is called First Past the Post. Under this system, each voter votes for one person from a list of possible candidates, and whichever candidate receives the highest number of votes wins. There are a number of problems with that. First of all, when there are more than two candidates, it's quite possible, and in fact it happens all the time, that a candidate can win with less than 50% of the vote. For example, did you know that when California Governor Gray Davis was recalled in 2003, there were 135 names on the ballot to determine his successor? Not a lie. You can look it up if you want. One of them was Arnold Schwarzenegger, who won that election, certainly due to his celebrity status, although there were some other notable celebrities on the ballot as well. Do you think First Past the Post was the best way to determine that winner? And any voter who favors any candidate who isn't one of the top two must choose whether to support a party they don't like or waste their vote. And if there's one right-wing candidate and two left-wing candidates, or vice versa, the candidate on the one side may be elected simply because the votes were split between the other two candidates, even though those voters, who may comprise the majority of voters in that riding, may have hoped for the candidate who won to be defeated by any means necessary. Whenever an election is called, polling companies always try to get a feel for how people will vote and which party is most likely to win, by asking random people how they're planning to vote. What happens next is the results of these polls are made public, and voters use this information to decide how to vote strategically. You will observe that the percentage of people who actually vote for the Green Party is always less than the number of people who say they will vote Green in the polls. This is not a statistical anomaly. This is a direct result of strategic voting. My system resolves all of these problems. I realize that, but I think it's important to have more than two candidates on a ballot so as to give the voters more choice. Of course, I agree that voters should have the choice of more than two candidates. Under my system, you can have as many candidates as you want on a ballot, and the result will be that the person who wins the election, when compared against any one of the other candidates, will be favored by the majority of the voters. What kinds of elections does your system work for? Any kind of election in which more than two candidates are seeking office. This could be for your member of parliament, your member of provincial parliament, the mayor of your city, student council elections in high schools, or even the President of the United States. The President of the United States? But I thought there was just a Democrat and a Republican and nobody else. It's not as well known that there were other candidates on the ballot besides Mitt Romney and Barack Obama. None of the other candidates were even invited to the debates because they don't have the necessary funding from big businesses to support them. That's why none of the good candidates ever become president. You always get some corporate puppet. Okay, so how does it work? Let's suppose there are 7 candidates in your riding or electoral district. Your ballot would have each candidate's name listed row by row, and beside each candidate's name are 7 circles, with the numbers 1 through 7 along the top above each circle. You would then rank the candidates from best, number 1, to worst, number 7. You would only be allowed to put at most 1 mark in each row, but you could have as many marks as you want in each column. That sounds a lot like the preferential voting system used in Australia. You didn't come up with this, you're just ripping off the Australians. Not exactly. There is a key difference between my system and the preferential voting system. In the preferential voting system, the least popular candidate is removed from the ballot immediately before recalculating the votes, similar to how contestants on American Idol are eliminated one by one until there is only one left. Under my system, it's possible for a candidate who would otherwise come in last to win by virtue of being the second choice of the majority of voters. You see, my system is a points-based system where each candidate would receive a point for each other candidate that they defeated on the majority of ballots. Then the candidate with the most points wins. That sounds cool, but your system would still have no effect in ridings where the winning candidate already had more than 50% of the vote anyway. That's where you're wrong. Under the current first-past-the-post system, most voters feel as though they are forced to choose the lesser of the two evils, so to speak. For example, in many ridings, it appears to be a tight race between the Liberals and the Conservatives, and none of the other parties have much chance of being elected. So what ends up happening is most of the people who would have preferred to vote for a fringe party, such as the Christian Heritage Party, end up voting either Liberal or Conservative instead, in order to have any chance of influencing the outcome of the election. Wouldn't it make sense to use a weighted system, where the number of points a candidate gets is based on their position on each ballot? No, that wouldn't make sense at all, and I'll tell you why. Voters who favor the Conservative Party, for instance, would attempt to influence the election by ranking fringe parties, such as the Communist Party, higher than more moderate parties, such as the Liberals or the NDP, just so that those mainstream parties will get less points. If a lot of people do this, we could hypothetically end up with a communist government, completely by accident. It's really not that democratic. So, if I understand you correctly, by giving people the option to rank the Conservatives ahead of the Liberals, or vice versa, without putting either of them in the number 1 spot on the ballot, they can still influence the outcome of the election while still supporting their favorite fringe party? Exactly. But I have a few problems with this. First of all, most people are not intelligent enough to understand your new voting system. Ideally, people like to go to the polling station, cast their vote for their favorite candidate, and be on their way. This is much too complicated. That is indeed a common objection. I think you don't give the average voter enough credit, but if indeed people would like to vote for just one candidate, they may still do so, just as they're used to doing. It would be the equivalent of ranking their favorite candidate above all the others, and ranking the others all equally. In effect, saying that if your favorite candidate doesn't get elected, then you don't care who does get elected out of the remaining candidates. Before you go to the polling station, you need to ask yourself if this truly reflects how you feel about the candidates, and keep in mind that this is the effect your vote currently has under the first-past-the-post system. Furthermore, the kind of people who find even this to be too confusing probably shouldn't be voting anyway. Think about it. Also consider that once this goes into effect, there will be a major educational campaign to get voters used to the idea. There will be all kinds of websites, ads on television, and flyers delivered door to door summarizing the voting process so that anyone will be able to understand it. You mean voters are allowed to be indifferent? Yes. Part of what makes for a proper democracy is giving voters the option of indifference. It's already happening now, with voters being allowed to decline or spoil their ballots. You mean like by voting communist? No, not at all. The Communist Party is a fringe party, but they do actually want to be elected, just like the mainstream parties. In fact, a communist candidate by the name of Fred Rose did get elected in the Quebec riding of Cartier in 1945. He ran as a Labour Progressive, but everybody knew at the time that the Labour Progressive Party was just another name for the Communist Party. So why is it that whenever I talk about spoiling ballots, people often assume I'm talking about voting for fringe parties? I mean spoiling a ballot by either leaving it unmarked, or marking all the candidates, or writing none of the above on the back side, or simply telling the people working at the polling station that you wish to decline your ballot. They actually keep track of how many people do that. How many people do that? Not very many. Usually less than 1% of those who even come to the polling station at all, and seldom enough to influence the outcome of the election. Regardless, you can't vote for the option of leaving the seat vacant. One of the candidates will always get elected, even if the majority were to decline or spoil their ballots. You may recall in past election campaigns when opposition parties were encouraging voters to vote ABC, anything but conservative. Now you can do that. It doesn't have to be anything but conservative, but anything but insert your least favorite party's name here. One time a reporter asked Danny Williams, the Premier of Newfoundland, who he would prefer to win if it were between the Conservatives and the Bloc Québécois, and there were no other options. He responded by saying the NDP. Yeah, that's right, this genius was the Premier of Newfoundland. Now, while his answer suggests that he wouldn't understand ranked comparisons, the system was designed exactly for people like him who would rather vote against a candidate than for a candidate. What happens in the event of a tie? A tie would not be likely under ranked comparisons, though not impossible either. There are three major parties in Canada right now, not counting the Green Party or the Bloc Québécois. They are the Conservative Party, the New Democratic Party, and the Liberal Party. It is theoretically possible that the majority of voters in one riding would think that the Conservative Party is better than the New Democratic Party, while the majority of voters think that the New Democratic Party is better than the Liberal Party, while at the same time the majority of voters think the Liberal Party is better than the Conservative Party. How is this possible? For the sake of simplicity, let's ignore the other parties and pretend there are just those three parties. Now let's say 20% of the voters rank the Conservative first and the Liberal second. 20% of the voters rank the Conservative first and the NDP second. 15% of the voters rank the Liberal first and the Conservative second. 10% of the voters rank the Liberal first and the NDP second. 35% of the voters rank the NDP first and the Liberal second. And 0% of the voters rank the NDP first and the Conservative second. With this unlikely breakdown, the Liberal beats the Conservative on 60% of the ballots. The Conservative beats the NDP on 55% of the ballots, and the NDP beats the Liberal on 55% of the ballots. In the event of a tie, my system would fall back to a preferential vote between the tied candidates, which in this case would eliminate the Liberal from the ballot, making it a race between the Conservative and the New Democrat, and the victory in this example would go to the Conservative candidate, and that's also who would have won under the first-past-the-post system. Having said that, I don't believe a tie would happen often, but ties actually have happened under the current system. It happened in a by-election in Marquette in 1871, in which case both candidates, a Liberal and a Conservative, were granted a seat. Since then, it has happened 3 times in Canada, once in Joliet in 1887, once in Assiniboia West in 1896, and most recently in Pontiac-Témiscamingue, and yes, I know I butchered the pronunciation of that word, in 1963. and in each of these cases, the returning officer, who had initially been exempt from voting, cast the deciding ballot. And in all three cases, the returning officer elected the Conservative or Progressive Conservative candidate. Note that there are more voters now than there were then, and an increase in the number of voters means a decrease in the probability of a tie occurring. I mean, what happens if the number of people who put the Conservatives ahead of the Liberals equals the number of people who put the Liberals ahead of the Conservatives? Oh, well, keep in mind that the probability of this occurring is astronomically small. But in that case, each party would get half a point, and the winner would be decided by who fared the best against the other parties. And then, if it's still a tie, we would probably fall back on the old method of having the returning officer decide who gets elected, although my personal preference in that situation would be to flip a coin. It's the cheapest way. Voters typically assign a high value to democracy, and so for that reason it may be practical from the standpoint of appeasing the voters to hold a second election, with only the names of those two parties on the ballot. Under the current system, funding is given to each political party based on the number of votes they receive. How will this change under your system? Under my system, only the party ranked at the very top of the ballot will be given that share of the funding. If the vote is indifferent between multiple parties ranked at the top, those parties will split that share of the funding. But that would increase funding to fringe parties, which in turn would increase the number of fringe parties and ultimately cost taxpayers more money. One of my coworkers actually said that to me when I presented this idea to him. I don't see how it's a bad thing at all that funding, which would otherwise have gone to a mainstream party, goes to fringe parties instead, because first of all, people are allowed to support whichever party they wish, either with their votes, or with party membership, or otherwise direct financial contributions. Second, this actually will not increase the cost to taxpayers at all. It just means that now your funding will be going to your favorite party, rather than to whichever party is your favorite between the top two parties. Third, I don't see an increase in fringe candidates as being a bad thing. Giving voters choices is a good thing, and an increase in the number of candidates means an increase in the probability that one of the candidates will actually be best suited for the job. Well, my third beef with your system is that it would be tedious for the vote counters to keep track of all the different rankings on millions of ballots across the country. We live in the 21st century. We have the technology to automate this process. I'm a programmer, and I've actually written a program that takes as its input a CSV file with the raw voting data, and then calculates the winner based on my system. It's been thoroughly tested, and works like a charm. In fact, if Parliament chooses to accept my voting system, I will go on record as saying that I will volunteer free of charge to count the votes in my own riding of Hamilton Mountain. So, while some voters may rank the candidates 1, 2, 3, etc., other voters may only vote for one candidate, as they are accustomed to doing. This makes the first vote carry more weight than the second vote, and is thus unfair. It's not unfair at all. The second voter in the scenario you described chose to be indifferent between the candidates he didn't vote for, and his vote for his favorite candidate still holds as much weight as the other voter's vote. Just one more problem I'd like to bring to your attention. In the last election, there were 8 candidates' names on my ballot, and I'd only ever heard of 4 of them. What am I supposed to do with the other 4 that I've never heard of? It's interesting that you should bring that up. Did you watch the all-candidates debate on television? Indeed I did. Of the 4 candidates I don't know, 2 didn't even show up to the debate. In fact, I didn't even know they were running until I saw their names on the ballot on election day. And the other 2 either said nothing or kept rambling about stuff I didn't care about. and about 80% of the debate was just the two richest candidates yelling at each other. The others hardly had a chance to speak at all. Failing to show up to a debate is like failing to show up to a job interview. The result is that you don't get the job. Did you visit these candidates' websites? Chances are they don't even have a website, which means either they're too lazy to put a website together, outlining their platform, or worse yet, they don't have a platform at all, or they don't want you to know about their platform, which means they won't take the views of their constituents into account when voting on the issues. They'll just vote the way they want, or worse yet, they won't vote at all. I'd strongly recommend putting such candidates on the bottom of your ballot. Having said that, ranked comparisons will give voters an incentive to learn as much as they can about each candidate so that they can rank them in an order that makes sense. If one of your candidates is a libertarian, libertarians tend to favor small government and less legislation, then you need to ask yourself which is worse, a bad government or no government at all. These are all good things to think about, and when all else fails, it is commonly believed that the devil you know is better than the devil you don't know. It's up to you whether or not to believe that. How many of you remember the Natural Law Party? They ran in 3 general elections and 5 by-elections between 1993 and 2000. They received 85,450 votes in the 1993 general election. Not enough to get a seat under the first-past-the-post system, but this would have gotten them 2 seats under proportional representation. Their platform was based on using yogic flying, which is basically just sitting cross-legged on a mattress and jumping up and down, to balance the budget, eliminate crime and poverty, and to create a force field to keep out enemy invaders, thus eliminating the need for any military spending. Well, that should at least appeal to those of you who are anti-war. Laugh all you want at the silly nature of the Natural Law Party's platform. It's probably still better than some of the parties that actually do have a chance of being elected, at least for comedic value. And then there's the Rhinoceros Party, based on a city in Brazil where a rhinoceros was literally elected mayor because the people were so dissatisfied with the people who were running for the position. The Rhinoceros Party's platform is so utterly ridiculous that a vote for them is like saying you don't care at all what the government does. What effect would this have on the likelihood of minority versus majority governments? We won't know for sure until the system actually gets implemented, but we've already seen minority governments happen again and again, and they are all too often brought down by opposition parties who are not in a position to form a coalition government. And we have been forced to go to the polls again to elect a new government, which is really, for the most part, the same government we already had, the only difference being that we've spent a whole lot of money unnecessarily on having another election. My coworker believes that the system may increase seats for fringe parties, which in turn would increase the likelihood of minority governments, which he views as being a bad thing. I, on the other hand, believe that it will have the opposite effect. Politicians from the party whose views are more or less in the middle of the spectrum of the views of the voters will be more likely to be elected, and we could see a majority of them in government. This would be a good thing, because it forces politicians to be more accountable to the voters. If a politician proves to be corrupt, even though his views may be in line with the views of the majority of voters, they will still get rid of him by any means necessary, by putting other politicians ahead of him on the ballot. Also, I'm not convinced that this would result in an increase in the frequency of elections. It has happened that minority governments could still work, and in fact minority governments do work quite well in other countries besides Canada. Our politicians just need to learn how to work with each other and respect the wishes of the voters. So, what would it take to get your system implemented? I've already presented my idea to Elections Canada, and Sean Boileau got back to me and told me that for this new voting system to become law, I would have to have it approved by the House of Commons. I emailed my Member of Parliament at the time, whose name is David Christopherson. David Christopherson, like myself, would like to see a change in the voting system. He is NDP. However, he favors proportional representation, as do many members of the Green Party. The Conservatives, of course, would be happy to stick with first past the post, since that's the system that keeps getting them elected over and over. It also worked well for the Liberals in the past, before the Progressive Conservative Party merged with the Canadian Alliance to form the new Conservative Party. I have since moved to another part of Hamilton, so my new Member of Parliament is Chris Charlton. I have sent her the link to this YouTube video, and I will keep you posted as to what she says about it. Jimmy, do you personally have anything to gain by having this system implemented? I think the entire country could benefit from an improvement in the voting system. As for myself personally, if you've seen my other YouTube videos, then you know that there is one particular issue that I feel very strongly about, and unfortunately the majority of MPs do not share my views. In fact, the majority of MPs do not share the views held by most Canadians on this issue. A ranked comparison system would force politicians to hold more moderate views on this issue so as to appeal to more voters. And even then, they won't go far enough, but at least it's still better than the status quo. If you message me privately, I will discuss this issue with you further. However, regardless of where you stand on that issue, there are many other issues that are important to Canadians, and each one of them will play a role in how the different parties stack up against each other in the eyes of the voters, and ultimately on the ballots in the ballot box. People will vote based on the issues that are most important to them, and politicians will be forced to take notice of this if they hope to be elected. It will be an all-around improvement to democracy. Are there any other ways in which you think democracy could be improved? Yes. We don't truly live in a democracy at this point because some people are denied the right to vote. Which people? Children. But children don't know enough about politics to make an informed decision. Most don't, but the same could be said of many adults. Why do you think Stephen Harper got elected? In fact, the same argument was used prior to 1921 to prevent women from voting. Did you know that in the past women weren't allowed to vote? Well, that's terrible. At least with children, they will eventually grow up and then they will be allowed to vote. Giving children the right to vote would increase the incentive for politicians to cater to the needs of families with children. Those are the people who are most in need of support from the government. Under what circumstances, if any, do you think voting should be mandatory? Voting should never be mandatory. Part of what makes this country great is the freedom we have to abstain from voting at all if we so choose. However, the reason many people cite for not voting is that their vote won't count anyway. Once my system is in place, every vote will count, so more people will have an incentive to go to the polls. But even so, there are some people who just aren't smart enough to vote. One of my former coworkers said that her vote was based on who was best dressed at the debate. Yes, I'm being completely serious. People who vote that way shouldn't vote. Now, if we lived in a country where every person cared about politics, then I could see that it would make sense to make voting mandatory. But the reality is that many people don't care about politics. And if any politician ever says that voting should be mandatory, I will fight them tooth and nail on this. So what can I do to help? Write a letter to your Member of Parliament and your Member of Provincial Parliament and even your City Councillor and advise them that you want this system of voting to be made law in whichever jurisdiction applies to the person to whom you're writing.